He is invisible. Invisible but quantifiable. Over the past 20 years, carbon dioxide, Mr. CO2, has become and is set to remain a cumbersome character in a drama with a worldwide array of roles. A drama shrouded in smoke, which is choking us. December 2009. A few days before the end of the 15th Conference on Climate Change, the atmosphere is as overheated as the object of discussion. 10 years after the Battle of Seattle at the World Trade Organization Summit, the Copenhagen Climate Conference marks a new wave of protest. There are over 600 arrests among the 50,000 street demonstrators, a few hundred of which force entry to the conference, adding chaos to the existing confusion. Opposite them, the vast Bella Center conference hall resembles a reinforced camp.
Fair, ambitious and binding deal, that's what we need here. Make your decision.
20,000 accreditations have been granted to the recently increasing number of NGO delegations, although most of them end up being removed from the premises.
Take this away. Global warming. Oh, he wants global warming. Oh, some, only some. Yeah. Fair, ambitious, binding deal is the Green Gate. Make your choice today, please.
With Copenhagen as a backdrop, social criticism and ecologist issues become one. The Copenhagen summit is of an unparalleled scope. In late 2009, the issue of global warming appears to have convened the entire planet's pertinent scientists, economic pressure groups and politicians. Hundreds of negotiators from 190 countries, the full ranks of United Nations staff, environment ministers, foreign affairs ministers, and political top brass stride down the interminable corridors from meeting to meeting. Some 5,000 journalists are covering the event, in which stars that have recently converted to ecology steal the limelight. But the real star of the show is this chap. He hovers over the debates. The climate skeptic spin and political pussyfooting are of great reassurance to him. He can listen to the scientists' warnings, feeling calm and collected.
Most of what has happened in the last 50 years or so is the result of human actions. And on this basis, we've also made projections of the future. We have mentioned, for instance, that even with the 2-degree rise in temperature, we will have some impacts that will be very serious. So the world is currently talking about this 2-degree limit or target, but it's not as though that's going to provide comfort to every community in the world. There are some communities that would be very badly affected.
The still ongoing aim of the conference is to ensure that global warming does not increase by these 2 degrees by the year 2050. These additional 2 degrees correspond to an atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide of 450 ppm. ppm, or parts per million, is the unit of measurement for carbon dioxide concentration levels in the air. Degrees of heat and parts per million rise together. Mr. CO2, your papers, please. Name, Mr. CO2. Also known as carbon dioxide, or CO2 for short. Current atmospheric concentration of CO2, 390 ppm. Growth rate, 3 ppm per year. CO2 concentration by 2050 at this rate, 520 ppm. A rise of 3.5 degrees. Signature. But it is at the Climate Forum in the city centre that associations and citizens gather once again, in parallel to the negotiations between states, to discuss the crux of the issue, with demands that are closer to reality. And it is in this context that the NGO 350.org highlights the relentless increase in degrees and ppms. Global warming started in the 1980s when it crossed the 350 ppm threshold. Since then, consumption has risen, production has increased, there are fewer forests, and the figure is climbing.
No deal is better than a bad deal.
The target figure, a lost dream, recurs like a leitmotif. People pray at the 350 high mass with enough personal conviction to move mountains. And founder of the 350 movement, Bill McKibben, sets the stage.
We're dealing with a present crisis. We're past the red line. But the real debate that's underway is between human beings on the one hand and physics and chemistry on the other, okay? That's who the adversary is, and that's a tough negotiation because physics and chemistry don't negotiate. They tell you what their bottom line is right out. We know now what their bottom line is. Their bottom line is 350. When people would say, well, this is too complicated, no one can understand this kind of science. We said, no, it's actually really not hard at all. Think about your own body, you know? If you go to the doctor and the doctor says, your cholesterol level is too high, okay? It's supposed to be 200 and yours is 300. You say, okay, I understand that. Now's the time I better change my diet and start taking my pill and whatever it is. That's what we try to get across all the time. We now know the most important thing about carbon in the atmosphere. How much is too much, where the red line is. It's no longer hard to figure out, it's all too clear.
Go 850, no 350, that'll make a rich person.
It is the target of 350 parts per million that we need to realistically assure only 2 degrees of warming. And that, you know, that analysis is pretty strong now. It's fairly widely agreed. So 450 parts per million may not be sufficient to limit to 2 degrees warming.
3, 5, oh, 3, 5, oh, 3.
The European Union has the best role and has set a 20 or even 30% reduction in emissions for 2020 in relation to 1990. They are eager to give lessons with their climate and energy package agreed in 2008 and their, albeit irregular, observance of their Kyoto commitments.
Les Européens qui ont 10 ans d'avance voudraient qu'il y ait tout d'un coup l'accord parfait final, l'accord parfait par lequel tous les pays ont quelque chose à faire, on a des objectifs, on a une feuille de route. Et en réalité, avec 10 ans d'avance, comme un coureur échappé, c'est difficile. Quand vous avez les poids lourds, si je puis dire, du peloton derrière, très loin derrière, et notamment les États-Unis et la Chine. Et les États-Unis et la Chine, c'était à la fois les deux freins, parce que aucun ne voulait faire quelque chose si l'autre ne faisait pas pareil.
For Mr. CO2, recognizing his main suppliers and protectors is not rocket science. Two countries between them, the US and China, emit more than 40% of the planet's greenhouse gases. These two leading world economic powers have become the duo to be reckoned with at every international summit, with their leaders observing and confronting one another. On the penultimate day of the Copenhagen conference, the heads of state arrived to try and reach an agreement. Until then, China had been exempt from observing any particular limits, as it was considered to be a developing country. But since Kyoto in 1998, the country has moved into the heavyweight category. Chinese Prime Minister Wen Jiabao arrives in good company. The 6 billion tons of CO2 that China is now emitting every year have placed his country at the head of the world emissions league table. As for the US, they'd always refused to ratify restricting agreements such as the Kyoto Protocol. The Bush administration even pushed the issue to the top of their agenda. The 5.5 billion tons the US emits every year arrive along with new President Barack Obama. He is admittedly more well-intentioned than his predecessor, but bound by Congress and the Senate, he arrives empty-handed.
If Barack Obama arrived and said, I've listened to the scientists that we paid good money to go out and research these questions. We're not going to cut our emissions 4% by 2020. We're going to cut them 40%, which science demands. If Barack Obama said that, then the world would have half a fighting chance.
Figures are put forward, but each party has their own reasons for doubting the good faith of the other. And the US versus China confrontation continues, with their respective sovereignties at stake.
We must have a mechanism to review whether we are keeping our commitments and exchange this information in a transparent manner. These measures need not be intrusive or infringe upon sovereignty. They must, however, ensure that an accord is credible and that we're living up to our mutual obligations. Without such accountability, any agreement would be empty words on a page. There are those developing countries that want aid with no strings attached and no obligations with respect to transparency. They think that the most advanced nations should pay a higher price. I understand that.
应对气候变化，绝不能无视历史责任，无视人均排放和各国的发展水平，绝不能延续发展中国家的贫穷和落后为代价。按照联合国标准，还有1.5亿人生活在贫困线以下。发展经济、改善民生的任务十分艰巨。我们正处在工业化、城镇化快速发展的关键阶段。
The Chinese accuse the US of making insufficient efforts to reduce CO2 emissions, and the US, concerned by Chinese unfair competition, wants a guarantee that Beijing will honor its commitments. Their conflict ends up in an objective alliance to torpedo the Copenhagen summit.
The two most important countries, China and the United States, desperately want more economic growth. And up to this point, most of their economic growth has come as a result of burning ever-increasing amounts of oil, gas, and coal. It's going to be very difficult for those countries to continue increasing the scale of their economies while using less in the way of fossil fuels. So this puts political leaders in a bind.
Meanwhile, until the issue is resolved, the ravages of time have set to work. And Mr. CO2 is getting fat on the increasingly prolific emissions. This energy is contributing, more than any other type, to global warming. When burnt, coal emits more than its own weight of CO2 into the atmosphere. There doesn't appear to be any sign of a let-up in China's fossil fuel consumption requirements. In 2010, the country devoured almost half of all the coal burnt worldwide. Coal today accounts for close to 65% of China's total energy supply. What's more, the task of operating a smooth-running national policy is complicated by the fact that coal exploitation comes under the authority of local regulatory bodies.
你这是在干嘛呢？
这干啥？你看这是干啥了？你看的这是干啥了？我可讲解不了，我们要能说服能力。你不要跟我扯了，你给我扯，我。
你来讲一下你这干嘛呢？这个刚才讲的不知道你在干嘛呢？问我。
不懂，我也不懂这是干啥了，我讲解不了，我会干不会讲解。
哦，把那个石头捡出来是吧？
哦，是。
煤矸石嘛是吧？
哦，
是煤矸石吧？
是。
就是没有别的副业吗？就光是挑煤挣钱吗？就像在家种地了。
也种地，该种地种地。
Coal is also a source of all kinds of local airborne pollutants. So the burning of the coal, the most immediate impact is on our own people, it's damaging the air quality. It's discharged so much pollutants. So why we continue building all these coal power plants at such a speed, despite the fact that there are some other options? The reason is that each time, when we try to decide how to deal with a local energy shortage problem, it always looks so much cheaper to build another coal power plant.
But first and foremost, coal serves to fuel the staggering boom in the production of iron, steel, cement, fertilizer, and of course, electricity.
China gets something like 80% of its electricity from coal. It has no other options. China and India together are planning to build 800 new coal power plants over the next 20 years.
Even during the heyday of the Great Leap Forward, Mao Zedong could never have dreamt that such a vast network of coal mines could one day be possible. Since his era, production has increased 60-fold. More than 4 million miners work in 25,000 mines, half of which are private and often illegal. This one in Shaanxi, 400 kilometers southwest of Beijing, is a very deep showpiece mine that operates 24 hours a day. The teams work in shifts, and it takes them over an hour to travel down to the exploitable coal scene.
We 们录完了去年5500万吨煤炭产量，那么大体3个用途，一块呢用到了这个煤化工，另一块呢用到了冶金。 还有一块用到了发电，基本比例也差不多。这就是从煤，直接到了油，这么一个整个的一个工艺流程的一个园区。
Coal covers the nation's energy needs, and even 5% of its petrol consumption. The conversion process requires vast quantities of water, in a country where the resource is lacking, with a heavy cost to the environment. Carbon dioxide abounds, But production is urgent, and there is no time to slacken the pace. For the foreseeable future, coal will remain key to China's independence. It is the country's major source of energy. The miners have a tough job and face danger down the mines on a daily basis. With nearly 5,000 deaths in 2009, the country holds the worst safety record in the industry. And yet there is no shortage of prospective miners, because with a monthly salary of 200 euros, they can earn more than in any other industry. But even so, Chinese miners can no longer produce enough to fulfill the country's increasing requirements. And despite the fact that China is the world's leading producer of coal, it must source the raw material from abroad.
Where will the coal come from? China's coal production is practically at peak right now. China is engaged in buying future coal supplies from Australia and Indonesia.
A Chinese presence can be witnessed throughout Australia. 60% of Australian exports are bound for China, which has recently become the leading importer of Australian coal, ahead of Japan. In Gladstone, Queensland, coal for the Chinese market is unloaded from trains onto conveyor belts.
We only have about 400 ships visiting the coal terminal here, but that will double, so there will be over 1,000 ships. I don't know who's going to stop China doing that for a considerable number of decades. So yes, at this point in time, we certainly see 10 to 15 years of glory in the coal industry.
Chinese imports of coal have doubled over the last 2 years. By 2013, China is said to be importing 600 million tons a year, almost equivalent to total coal exports from all countries. Australia had been concerned about the drop in world demand for raw materials, but the Chinese steelworks are consuming so much energy that even during the crisis, boats left Australian shores laden with cargo. The future of coal would appear to be bright, and all the more so since brand new rhetoric has endowed it with ecological properties.
So what has to happen around the world is that there has to be clean coal production, and that comes down to how you treat the coal when it goes into the power stations. The concentration has to be on developing the technology to allow us to burn the coal so that you don't have the CO2 emissions that hang off it.
Among the whole host of approaches put forward to clean up coal or to make it green, one is particularly tempting: the process of sweeping carbon dioxide, as it were, under the carpet. The Luan thermal power plant is the only one of its kind in China. Ideograms emphasize the aims of its program.
能源主要还是依托着煤炭。那么煤炭，如何，叫它实现这个高碳能源、低碳的利用？就说绿色的开采，它把这个，抽瓦斯的这个孔啊，把瓦斯抽完以后，然后把这个二氧化碳呢就打进去，上煤了。
Instructions for capturing and storing carbon dioxide. Step 1. Capture CO2 emissions at source. Step 2. Compress the CO2 and sequester it underground. Warning: unfortunately, the process itself will emit CO2, the equivalent of 30% of what is being stored. Presented as a miracle solution, the underground capture and storage of carbon dioxide produced at the thermal power plants has been gaining ground for about a decade. 140 plants all over the world are currently either operational or in a test phase. They are mainly located in the United States and Europe, or here in Canada. But solving global warming without restricting our energy consumption is an industrial dream that is not risk-free.
The primary concerns and one of the biggest focus of the research efforts for carbon sequestration is to make sure that the injection into the ground is effective. In other words, making sure it stays there for a long time and is safe, that if it does leak, that it causes no harm, and that it's environmentally sound. In other words, there's also worry that if it leaks out in too big a concentration, it can be harmful because too much CO2 congregated in a place can cause asphyxiation. We don't try to solve one environmental problem at the expense of causing another.
含水层有多少？会不会透气？这个地壳这个盖子有多大？那么二氧化碳容易液化，压力多大，能够把它压下去？这个都非常的耗能，本身就耗能。那么作为 CCS 是不太经济也不科学。那么我们现在是通过和国家发改委。
Given the level of emissions, the Chinese coal nightmare will not be able to vanish into the appropriate geological layers of the Earth, which in China are not only rare, but also unsafe. But China wants to reinforce its prime position in the world economic system at all costs.
So Australia produces a lot of coal, it gets exported to China. China produces products with this coal, and those products get exported to the United States and to Europe. And all along this chain, people have incentive to keep this system going because it's in Australia's economic benefit to sell this coal. It's in China's benefit to have this cheap energy source and to be able to sell products to the West, and then the West benefits by getting the cheap products from China.
It has been a long time since the US has enjoyed growth in double figures. But it is the decades of high levels of consumption and its accumulated CO2 emissions that make it the main culprit. The #1 world economy devours all energy, guzzling greedily. But the same can also be said of most Western countries, and this calls for calculations.
When people ask how much carbon dioxide emission is the United States or France responsible for, they look at the amount of carbon dioxide actually emitted within the borders of the individual country. But if we think of the things that we consume in a given day, we're consuming all of these goods and services that are created somewhere else. We get lots of products from China, for example. And so we ask the question, if we think of how much carbon dioxide was released to make the products that we consume, how much carbon dioxide emission are we responsible for in terms of our consumption? If you look just within the country, with France with its nuclear power and Switzerland, it looks like they don't use very much power at all. But each kilogram of stuff coming into Europe, more than 1 kilogram of CO2 was produced somewhere else to make that import. These countries tend to be among the richest in the world, and the richest people consume the most. And so if we just look at raw numbers of CO2 emission within the country, China now emits more carbon dioxide than the United States. But if we look at the carbon dioxide for the products and services consumed in a given country, that the United States is still responsible for more emission than China. So China is emitting carbon so that we can consume more products. And so per capita, China is much, much better than the United States.
And neither of these two countries would profit from regulating their carbon dioxide emissions.
I think this shows that if we just develop strong carbon emission controls in the United States and in Europe, that will not be enough, because it will provide incentive to produce even more of our products in countries that don't have strong carbon controls. And so, for example, if China does not develop strong carbon controls, that will just give more incentive to make products in China and export them to the United States and Europe. And this has consequences not only for carbon dioxide emissions, but also for jobs, because by pushing the emissions offshore, we also tend to push the jobs offshore, and it makes it much more politically difficult, I think, to get the controls that we need.
The workshop of the world insists on exercising total freedom to produce. China does not agree to curtailing its economic expansion via a system of controlling its carbon dioxide emissions. The newfound importance of the country gives it the means to refuse any internal interference. The Copenhagen summit established the era of Chinese power, as the #1 negotiator confidently affirms.
现在到了这个哥本哈根会议谈判的一个非常关键的时期，所以呢，下面我希望媒体在提问题的时候，咱们尽量往这个积极的、这个有希望的方向来引导。And also try to be nice. Next question, please.
I hope this is positive and hopeful, but what I would like to know is whether there are any circumstances in which China would be willing to have emission reductions checked internationally, checked, verified internationally. Are there any ways that that impasse can be broken?
我们国家也要定期的发布中国应对气候变化的政策与行动白皮书，那么也要这个定期的发布中国这个应对气候变化政策措施的这个进展报告。我想这个在这个墙外头可能架子上还有一些中国的白皮书也好，国家方案也好，还有这个进展报告。你们想说啥就可以说啥，当然也有一些限制，只要遵循一个客观公正能够实事求是不是说这个这种故意不符合事实的这样的评论，我想我们也是欢迎的。
And China is no longer alone. It has found allies in the other major emerging countries like India or Brazil, eager like China to preserve their growth. Otherwise, competing against the rich countries, their economies will be brought to a standstill. So by the end of the confrontation, what has become of the poor countries, some of which are already severely threatened by climate change?
Generally, what happens at these things is the U.S. and a few others go in and tell the poor countries of the world what the score is and say, we're going to give you some money and now shut up. And one after another, those countries said, look, we deserve and need some money to deal with this, some adaptation money and whatever. But we also know there's not enough money in the world to help us if we're underwater, if all our pastures have turned to desert.
I'm here to say I am from the South and I am not responsible. I am owed economic debt, ecological debt, and climate debt, and payment must be done now.
climate debt agents who works to get the rich polluting countries to pay their climate debt to the countries affected by the climate changes. And we are from Action Aid Denmark, and we demand money on the table now.
At the very end of the conference, the poor countries obtained a promise of $30 billion to invest in green energy.
On va se battre ici pour demander des chiffres, on va nous promettre tout. Le jour où ça se fera, j'y crois. Je ne peux pas fonder ma politique sur des promesses, puisque ça fait 10 ans que je suis au G8, que je participe aux réunions du G8. Ça fait 10 ans qu'on nous promet chaque fois 50 milliards de dollars. Je les attends encore.
Mr. CO2's barefaced prosperity is intimately linked to another issue: the close relationship of wealth to CO2 emission levels. And it was Hugo Chavez who, intending to provoke his audience, highlighted the issue that climate change cannot be fought without taking social inequality into consideration.
Bueno, fíjense, por ahí tuve el gusto de conocer a este escritor francés, Herbert Kempf. Recomiendo este libro, lo recomiendo, se consigue en español, por ahí está Herbert, también en francés, en inglés seguramente. Cómo los ricos destruyen el planeta. ¿Será que piensan irse para otro cuando destruyan este? Tendrán planes para irse a otro planeta. Hasta ahora no se ve ninguno en el horizonte de la galaxia.
Si presque 7 milliards d'humains vivaient comme nous, une seule planète Terre ne suffirait pas. Il en faudrait un peu plus de 3 si on adoptait les standards de vie d'un Français, et presque 7 si on adoptait les standards de vie d'un Américain. C'est-à-dire que la croissance économique est génératrice non seulement d'inégalités sociales, mais elle nous conduit droit dans le mur.
Los 500 millones de personas más ricas, 500 millones, esto es el 7% de la población mundial. Ese 7% es responsable. Esos 500 millones de personas más ricas son responsables del 50% de las emisiones contaminantes.
The relationship between income and carbon dioxide emissions cannot be resolved via simple state-to-state accounting. Indeed, it calls into question the whole system of wealth distribution worldwide.
There's a tremendous amount of inequality when it comes to carbon emissions worldwide. So what you have is that a lot of the emissions in different parts of the world come from the rich. Okay, but I have to say that this is the global rich. So the global rich might be just middle class in Europe, which means that more of Europe will be involved in the global rich. So it's very important to realize that when I say rich, I refer to somebody who is rich by global standards, which most Europeans or Americans will not consider themselves rich because they think they're middle class, but they're actually, by global standards, they are consuming a lot.
Si vous prenez, par exemple, le patrimoine, c'est-à-dire l'ensemble des biens accumulés, si vous avez un patrimoine personnel de 5 650 €, il y a beaucoup d'enfants qui ont plus de 5 650 €, eh bien vous appartenez déjà aux 50% les plus riches de la planète. Si vous avez un patrimoine de 45 000 €, c'est-à-dire même pas le prix d'un petit studio, vous appartenez aux 10% les plus fortunés de la planète. Et si vous avez un capital de 375 000 €, vous appartenez aux 1% les plus riches de la planète.
We have about 3.5 billion people here who emit less than 2 tons of carbon dioxide per capita, so which is more than India's average. And then you have about 2 billion people between 2 and 10 tons of carbon dioxide. So 10 is the average of Europe. And you have more than 700 million people above 10 tons of CO2. For example, the US is at 20 tons of carbon dioxide per person per year. The lowest emissions come from people in Africa or India or Bangladesh, and some Chinese. Then in the middle, you'll have Brazil, China, Japan, most of Europe. And the very high emitters are mostly from Europe or US. So using that to come up with, to propose a different way of distributing the job of reducing carbon emissions to different countries. If a country has a large number of high emitters, people emitting more than 10 or 15 tons of carbon dioxide per year, then it should do more. Whereas if a country has a lower number of high emitting people, then they should do less. So in 2030, if you want to keep emissions to today's levels, which is not a very ambitious target, which is equivalent to something like 450, 500 parts per million. If you wanted to do that, then what it would involve is if every person in the world had an emissions budget, then the maximum would be about 10.
The current world average is 14 tons. A move back down to 10 tons would mean eliminating all emissions above and beyond this level. And it is the world's 700 million emitters with annual revenues in excess of 30,000 euros who are to blame.
The approach is to come up with a target for the countries. If you want France to meet its target and also take into account of this inequality, then it should have the right policies inside its country. Maybe it should tax, flying or big cars more. And any policy that we design to control carbon dioxide emissions should take this inequality into account.
The report is in the hands of United Nations heads, but has little hope of gaining unanimous support, as targeting each country's wealthy population via a tax on consumption takes on overtones of a social revolution in which no state is willing to engage. While waiting to lower the economy's carbon footprint, various solutions are in the offing, but all of them involve the need to price carbon.
On pourrait concevoir une comptabilité économique carbone. C'est d'ailleurs les empreintes carbone, ça se fait. Et il est possible que dans les années à venir, le commerce mondial soit dominé par l'empreinte carbone aussi. C'est-à-dire qu'on dise, voilà, combien ça a coûté, s'il vous plaît, en carbone, votre produit, d'où il vient, enfin, etc. Ça, à mon avis, ça va venir, mais ça va nous faire beaucoup de discussions à l'OMC et ailleurs.
In Copenhagen, Barack Obama and his representative John Kerry were not in a position to make real proposals backed up by figures, but they hope to be able to do so soon.
Those who say we will not pass something are wrong. Next year, I tell you, next year, the United States Congress, House and Senate will pass comprehensive energy climate legislation that will reduce America's emissions. More and more businesses and more legislators are becoming convinced that the only way to meet an emissions reduction target is to price carbon.
The United States owes its prosperity to cheap energy. What incentives are there to price carbon for the country that is the king of fossil fuel consumption? All the economic solutions necessarily involve emissions quotas and a fixed price for carbon, whether via consumer taxation or via the financial markets. But the latter solution is proving unacceptable for the energy sector pressure groups.
Those forces that want nothing to happen are pouring everything they've got into this fight. And what they've got, a lot of, among other things, is money. ExxonMobil made more money last year than any company in the history of money. I mean, they're well armed to fight this kind of fight, and they've been putting it into think tanks and websites and whatever else, doing their best to confuse people.
In July 2010, 8 months after the Copenhagen summit, the Obama administration and his Democrats were forced to abandon plans to have their energy bill passed by the Senate.
In order to pass comprehensive energy climate legislation, you got to reach 60 votes. And to reach those 60 votes, you got to have some Republicans. And as we stand here today, we do not have one Republican.
Now, obviously, everyone is disappointed that we do not yet have agreement on comprehensive legislation. We will continue to work with the senators to craft important comprehensive legislation.
The U.S. Senate isn't paying attention to the science. It's paying attention to ExxonMobil and to the coal industry and to the most narrow and short-sighted set of ideological preoccupations. It looks like America's political system is pretty well broken.
And the US attended the climate conference in Cancun, Mexico in December 2010 without any Senate-backed agreement on the reduction of their carbon dioxide emissions.
Internationally negotiated climate agreements are probably obsolete, but the world hasn't recognized that yet. So we get these minimalist agreements that don't really add up to very much. Kyoto was the first example of this. It takes years to negotiate these agreements, and then many more years to get them ratified. By that time, the game may be over.
If we simply wait for the economic crisis, for the climate crisis to force us to change, then unfortunately we'll have the worst case scenario. We will be simply reacting to one crisis after another. And the 21st century could, in that case, be a century of devastating impacts.
Mr. CO2 can hover around his heart's content. And, holding the US up as the model to aspire to, the West's addiction to fossil fuel has spread like a virus.
People really do not have a grasp of the magnitude of the amount of energy that we consume every day. I mean, during a typical year, globally, we consume 1.25 trillion gallons of oil. I mean, if I started consuming gasoline at 1 gallon a second, it would take me 40,000 years to consume what we consume in 1 year. In other words, we're consuming 40,000 gallons of oil every single second, and we're consuming about 30,000 gallons of equivalent in coal every single second.
We're reaching peak gas. Even coal is going to run out much sooner than we have assumed. Now, if we're going to avoid a situation where we're basically fighting over the crumbs of what's left of the world's fossil fuel supplies, the only other serious avenue that we could pursue in the world is to seriously reduce our reliance on fossil fuels.
Research into fossil fuel substitutes is gathering pace. Both developed and emerging countries are gearing up to compensate for the predicted shortages and to reduce their carbon dioxide emissions.
We're looking at algae, direct fuels from algae, and there's some really big advantages of the fuels we get out of algae. I mean, I've actually been working on this for 25 years. And this is a race. It's a race to see who can build the infrastructure to make bioenergy. Where is the conversion? At what point do we as a society admit that climate change is significant enough that I stop lobbying against it and start accepting its reality and preparing to deal with its consequences? That's the real question.
So how should we go about creating this vital change in energy supply? If it's not already too late, time is racing by.
100 years from now, the only energy we will be using in society will be energy from renewable sources like wind, solar, tidal, geothermal, wave power, and so on.
Everybody knows that 50 or 60 years from now, this is how we'll power the world. That's not really in question. What's in question is, can we do it in 20 or 25 years, in the time that scientists give us to have any real hope of heading off the climate stuff?
In spite of governments' recovery plans, the world crisis has hit investments in sustainable technologies, which plummeted by 7% in 2009 compared to 2008, before stabilizing in 2010. With one exception, China. To support growth, China needs to build 580 coal-fired thermal plants over the next 10 years, the equivalent of one per week. In 2009, the Chinese government also invested over 100 billion euros in renewable energies, a world record.
The understanding in China of the need for a different kind of energy system and the extent to which they are able to mobilize investment resources in that new energy system, the speed at which that kind of technological revolution is happening in China is now beginning to dwarf anything that we've created over 20 years of working on it in Western economies, and it's happened in the space of a few years. It's a case study. I mean, it's something almost unprecedented.
In the solar panel manufacturing sector, Chinese companies can already cater for domestic demand in photovoltaic energy, as well as being able to export all over the world. 45% of the solar panels in California are made in China.
国家可能要出台的，到2020年呢，中国的这个太阳能光伏发电装机容量要达到2000万千瓦和现在的40万千瓦。 这个比重这个增长量还是非常大的，是吧？大概要增长50倍，所以这个比重还是很大的。目前已经建成的发电能力呢是700千瓦，在整个中国，在全球产业链是最完整的。
This is a recent market for China, and the high-tech appearance of a budding 21st century appeals to the ecological aspirations of visitors. And of course, buyers.
I想呢，我们这个太阳能酒店，包括我们这个太阳能会展中心，应该说有点法国人的浪漫情怀。这个太阳能电池板呢，既能发电，又能起到遮阳作用。 这个也为和谐创造了一个很好的条件，是人类目前一种非常好的这个清洁能源的方式。
The sun yields unparalleled power. Capturing just a few hours of its total energy would be enough to fuel the most energy-hungry excesses. The era of solar power plants is now with us, and the Californian sun is worth its weight in gold. Companies are already seeking to tap into the gold mine.
Nobody's investing in this really for altruistic reasons. They believe that it's a very viable, thriving sector of the economy, and they want to participate in that. BrightSource is fortunate to have some world-class investors. We started with two of the best venture groups, Vantage Point and Draper Fisher, and then we had BP, Chevron, others invest in the company, Google invested along the way.
But state impetus is vital. And although 12% of the US recovery plan budget has been allocated to clean energy, that amount remains modest. Among the main desert-owning states, the first choice has been Nevada. Its vast, arid surface area lends itself well to housing a huge concentration of solar panels. And it is here that the country's largest solar power plant has been built, right next door to Las Vegas, the city of all excesses. Let's take a look around. Mr. CO2 is not welcome here.
The
power is fed into the grid. It basically comes into these towers over here you can see behind the control room. So the power is actually being produced behind that brown building way down there. Comes out of there into this switching station here, and it's basically going to Las Vegas after that. We only produce during the daytime.
Ironic for a town that comes to life at night. It's also why the world's #1 consumer of electricity remains dependent on its coal plants.
If you look at the amount of energy that the sun delivers to the earth, we don't have an energy problem, we have an energy collection and distribution problem. Basically the sun brings us 5,000 times every day the amount of energy that we need or consume. We just need to be able to collect it and distribute it in order to be able to use it properly.
In the US in 2009, total electricity production from renewable sources was less than the figures for Europe and even China. Before carbon dioxide emissions are reduced, Mr. CO2 can still do some serious partying. And on a worldwide scale, he has plenty of time to see things coming.
Everybody's right now focused on how do you handle the scale and the amount of power that needs to get delivered on a worldwide basis. If you look at the global challenge right now, we have, between now and 2050, we need to provide about 14,000 gigawatts of carbon-free power. A gigawatt is about the size of a nuclear facility. So 14,000 equivalent size power plants to a nuclear plant need to be built between now and 2050 to address the carbon problem.
Depends entirely on what kind of commitment we get, whether or not we get governments making this job one, whether or not we see real and decisive switches in subsidy and funding from fossil fuels in the direction of clean energy.
A smattering of environmental policies will not be enough to meet our planet's needs. Wind turbines and solar panels require such extensive investment and such vast surface areas that they will remain, for the time being, supplementary energy sources, and they both create ecological footprints of their own.
The problem is none of these renewable or alternative energies can be developed without a very large input of those fossil fuels to make them. I mean, let's take an example. If you look at photovoltaics, mine the metals that are needed to form the frame and the metals that are needed to form the rods to support it to whatever structure it's going to be on using the electricity produced from a solar panel. All of this then has to come together somewhere globally and turned into this final product. Every single step of the way, we are consuming diesel or gasoline or electricity or jet fuel or one of these fossil fuels. And so essentially at this point, all of these alternatives rely upon a fossil fuel foundation. And that is the weakness of the scalability and the feasibility of greatly expanding alternative energy production.
Mr. CO2 is still hanging around these renewable energy technologies, and his footprint is only likely to disappear once the various materials they require have been reviewed.
The true test of the long-term viability of an alternative energy to me is when it's what I call self-reproduction or reproducibility. So we have to look at that. How much are we going to be using to produce that energy, and how much is left over afterwards? That's a very big question. What are the pollutant side products from the process?
In the meantime, while we await an ideal alternative, wind turbines and solar energy account for just 3% of world energy. In a bid to improve matters, high-tech endeavors are underway. On a continent-wide basis this time, with, for example, one European consortium's ambitious project, Desertec.
We think it's a fantastic project. It will take some time, and it will take some patience, but at the end of the day, it's a very viable way to deliver power from an area of great sun in the Sahara Desert into continental Europe. And we think it, over the long term, has a lot of potential.
The project, supported by the German government, will require an investment of 400 billion euros. It could cover 15 to 20% of European energy requirements by 2025. The idea is to centralize the natural energies of several continents. Solar thermal power plants would be built in the heart of the Sahara Desert and linked via a network to Europe. The network would be reinforced by energy from offshore wind turbines in the North Sea. The era of major projects to save the planet has seen the light of day.
Le capitalisme vert, c'est rien d'autre que cette volonté d'adapter la planète, d'adapter l'écologie et, si nécessaire, d'adapter l'humanité elle-même aux besoins du toujours plus. Tout est prêt. Tout est prêt. Je dirais, les connaissances scientifiques, l'autonomie des grandes firmes, on calcule déjà le retour sur investissement. Tout est prêt, les fantasmes, l'idée d'un monde sans limite. Tout sera fait plutôt que de remettre en cause les logiques dominantes.
But regarding massive-scale projects with ecological overtones, China is the most ambitious. On a par with the magnitude of its state capitalism and its commercial excesses that allow for great audacity, China is once again setting off on a long march, a green one this time. October 2009, on the occasion of the parade commemorating the 60th anniversary of the victory of the Mao Zedong Revolution, commentators recite the new official creed.
After 60 years of work, China has worked to create a stable supply of economic, clean, and safe energies.
This float highlights China's energy achievements. It's powered by solar panels, the only one in the parade. This formation represents ecology and environmental protection. New China issued its first comprehensive regulations on environmental protection in the 1960s, and in the 1990s, environmental protection was upgraded to a state policy.
The scientific outlook on development calls for sustainable development, a well-off life, and a sound ecosystem. And this requires environmental awareness.
But if China prides itself on its accelerated alternative energy development program, it is not quite so quick to solve the issue of its sensational urbanization. It is estimated there will be 1 billion city dwellers by 2030. Models for clean cities abound. Yet no clean cities have actually seen the light of day yet, even though the ecological window dressing of a project does help attract investors. Promoters of the Chao Feidan project, close to the city of Tangshan, 250 kilometers from Beijing, have set their sights high. This is ecology on a colossal scale.
原来这就是一片盐碱滩涂地，现在你看，起码变成地了，现在形成了这个陆域，这速度就够快的了。非常快。我们测算一下，这个30平方公里的建设大概得用4000亿人民币的投资。让他们做这么这个宏伟的事，有魄力的这种，这么宏伟的事，确实已经超出了。中国经济也就靠着这些东西拉动的。 要没有这些大规模的城市建设，中国经济早垮了。将来这些项目要起来以后，这些个新的理念能够真的这个建设起来了，那这不得了的。从海上修一条道。
Chao Feidan's promotional film promises an ecological El Dorado. Traditional Western consumerism is featured, in keeping with the Chinese Communist Party's motto, A better city for a better life.
曹妃甸国际生态城，在这块盐碱滩涂上，即将建起一座高度开放、高度繁荣、高度文明的未来之城，一座文化创新、体制创新、环境创新的创新之城，一座产业协调、资源协调、生活协调的生态之城。
曹妃甸因为是刚建的，所以的这个我不知道上面就是，我们这儿有很多的关于唐山的记录，我们这边的这个水污染和空气污染地图里面有很多唐山这个环保部门所发布的那些记录，这些记录里面呢有很多是关于当地的这些钢厂，他们没有能够很好的去这个按照这个规定去排放。
It is not an isolated case, and the Chinese government has just threatened to close more than 2,000 factories for contravening regulations. In the first quarter of 2010, China's carbon dioxide emissions rose by more than 3%. It is hard to imagine that investing in renewable technology will be enough to reverse the process, or even to slow it down. The economic model of rampant growth is steering the country into a dead end. And China is not alone. It concerns the entire planet. Mr. CO2 is delighted. He knows all there is to know about the arithmetic of world growth.
We do not yet know how to create stable economies that are resource light, that provide equal opportunities for 7 billion people and a growing population, and that remain within ecological limits.
The race against the clock to stabilize the rise in the temperature at 2 degrees does not take into account demographic forecasts. By 2050, the world population will be 9 billion, 2 billion more than today. Increases in average per capita revenues will also fuel over-consumerism, which in turn will strengthen the link between lifestyle and carbon dioxide emissions.
We've done okay at bringing the technological intensity factor down over the last few decades, but carbon emissions have still gone up. Why? Because the economy's got bigger and there are more people in the world. And those things have always run faster than our cleverness, than our ability to get technology to reduce carbon emissions for each dollar. And that's the game. The game is that you have to get technology moving faster than the economy's growing.
It is a real and difficult gamble if we are to prevent all our societies adhering to another vision of well-being, that of the US model.
There are ways to sustain our life on alternative energy, but there's not a way to sustain our lifestyle. We expect things to be up and running 24 hours a day. We want our stores open all the time. We expect to cook in the middle of the night or early in the morning. So the implications of not having the supply meet demand at all times really means that we've got to be much more conscious of what our energy consumption is.
Einstein disait toujours que tant qu'on a la tête sous forme d'un marteau, on voit tous les problèmes sous forme de clous. Tant que nous aurons la tête formatée par l'économie, on ira toujours chercher la solution à tous les grands problèmes sociaux dans le toujours plus de production, toujours plus de consommation, c'est-à-dire bien sûr toujours plus de pollution et toujours plus d'émissions de carbone. Il faut reconnaître que c'est une société diablement efficace. Nous sommes tombés dans la marmite de la société de consommation il y a 70 ans et on en veut encore.
sweetheart, and welcome to your home, sweet home. And you like the jingling sound in your pocket when you walk. You like to listen to your own self, sweet talk. You say and turn your back.
These dynamics, the dynamics of the economy and the dynamics of society, almost psychological dynamics, are trapping us. They're trapping us into increasing carbon emissions. This is a powerful social logic, and it delves into the nature of what it means to be part of society. And so material goods, material aspirations, the way that our lives are organized, they're not just trivial things. It's not even beyond the simple material functionality of food and clothing and shelter. Material things play a psychological and social language for us. And this is a really important language. It's important for ordinary people, and that's why it's an iron cage. It's why it is such a strong social logic. It's not something that individuals can easily escape from.
You licked your fingers and collected your debt, telling everybody just how good it gets. You never thought about the lies you told. You never thought about the souls you sold.
Le terme de croissance, comme le terme de travail ou de production ou de consommation, sont des mots poisons, c'est-à-dire des mots qui nous empêchent de penser. Quand on parle de société de consommation, on s'imagine toujours que c'est simplement une société où on consomme plus que dans une autre. Mais ça, c'est l'apparence. En réalité, une société de consommation, c'est une société où on a désappris à avoir un certain type de rapport aux objets. La société de consommation, c'est la casse des cultures traditionnelles, c'est la casse des cultures populaires. Et les pays qui n'y sont pas encore tombés ne demandent que ça.
Right now, we are basically stuck in this country, in the whole Western world, and even in other countries, economies like India and China, with a growth imperative. The kinds of programs, policies, and actions that we need to be effectively able to deal with these issues of food and water and energy and climate change and so forth are policies that are largely inimical to business and to growth, the growth economy.
La solution, ça ne peut sûrement pas être de faire la même chose en moins. C'est pas en apprenant à se serrer la ceinture un peu beaucoup passionnément ou à la folie qu'on y arrivera. C'est en inventant des modes de vie, des façons de produire et de consommer radicalement différents.
The only other option, if we want to go in that direction, is for the people themselves to do something, to take hold of their communities and redesign them. And this would have to happen on a local basis with towns and cities working on their own to implement these kinds of policies. And the interesting thing is that that's actually where we're seeing this happening. This means towns, cities, families, communities charting a path to a low-carbon future. There's a whole movement of what's called the transition towns that are finding ways to grow more food locally, to insulate buildings, to provide more solar and other alternative energy within the community.
Four years ago, in Totnes in the UK, the Transition Town movement was born.
Oh yay! Oh yay! Oh yay! Welcome to the Totnes Home Energy Fair in the Civic Hall.
It's not just about energy, it's not just about food, it's not just about building, it's about the whole system. We all are in transition, whether we like it or not. We're not just saying, oh, let's go somewhere in the desert and build a completely new city. Well, anybody can do that. That's easy. Totnes is built. We're not going to knock it down and start again. We're going to have to take what we have and make it sustainable, make it fit for the 21st century. And those environmental concerns are going to be absolutely central and absolutely crucial.
Whatever names they go by, these movements are gaining ground all over the world.
I've been here. Maybe I'll be elsewhere.
In San Francisco, the same post-carbon ideal is taking over the city's vacant spaces.
But I'll be around. And with time running downhill.
We're looking at any vacant land, whether it's a vacant lot or a sidewalk or sometimes a right-of-way for automobiles, a street. Any possible place where we could put it to productive use to meet our needs for food, fuel, medicine, or fiber. Whatever useful, productive, integrated system can be designed there. We're looking for space creatively.
That's not usually what happens. What comes out of those.
Probably the highest priority of the permaculture community here in the city is just the backyards. About 1,800 acres of backyard in San Francisco waiting to be put into productive use. For me, it's a spontaneous ethical thing. It's emerging and evolving, sometimes slowly, but that's what we see in general.
Diving deep in my private river where my senses drain. I say we rush paradise.
All over California, post-carbon behavior is seeking revenge on the damaged American consumerism dream.
You walk down the street and you start looking at what's existing, where there's lemon trees and plum trees and pear trees, and you start meeting neighbors with different skill sets. And to start to vision as you go down, instead of all these different lawns, but edible landscapes. This guy right here has over 60 varieties of food on his property. Just a lot of opportunity. And so, you know, together our little efforts can make a difference. We had people from the left here, we had people from the right, we had labor, we had business people, we had environmentalists, all working together to, you know, strengthen our community.
When we look at these voluntary initiatives to live simpler and sometimes more rewarding lives, we should marvel, actually, that this exists, because it is a very, very strong ethical statement by relatively small numbers of people saying this logic is wrong, this logic is immoral, it doesn't take into account the aspirations of 2/3 of the world, it is unsustainable in ecological terms, and so we're going to live differently, we're going to try and make different choices.
So what I see is that there's a phenomenal amount of interest in transition all around the world from just about every continent. I have seen it working in Canada, in the United States, in New Zealand, in Japan, in Australia, and also in China as well as just about every European country. What's interesting are some of the cultural changes that people make. People start to do things maybe in slightly different ways, and they translate some of our materials in obviously in terms of their actual language.
In every country where these initiatives are taking form, they are sparking reflections on our dependence on the global economic system.
I call it a Cinderella economy because to some extent it already exists. There are examples of largely small-scale initiatives embedded in communities, providing jobs for people, and with a low carbon footprint, with resource-light activities, treading lightly on the earth. And so these kinds of activities represent a sort of blueprint for what an economy might be like.
The crisis has also been instrumental in speeding up people's choice to break away from previous lifestyles. And Willits, a small town in Northern California, has just taken the step of detaching itself, at least in part, from the US dollar. Like a few other communities in the US, locals have chosen to invent another form of consumerism.
See how much I get back. But these are ours. They have our little logo on it. They're $5. They're wooden. Who doesn't like a wooden nickel? Right? I loved them. I hung on to them when I was a kid, whether they were good for anything or not. $5 for me, I like to think that they're backed by beer. And right now, a pint does cost you $5. I can also give you a piece of paper that says it's worth one beer, but this is a lot more fun. They can also go to Mulligan's Books and buy a book, or if they have 25 of them, they can go get a massage. The idea behind this currency is to have that currency recirculate locally. Other communities have put quite a bit of local currency into circulation, and then it can have a much larger effect.
You found peace of mind just beyond the hills, a bottle in your hand, a pocket full of bills.
Actually, when you think about transition, you have to not just say, well, here's a nice example of some economic activity that might work. You actually have to address the structure of the system. And so that means looking at the big scale, it means looking at the macro scale and asking, are the incentive structures pointing in the right direction? Almost always the answer is no. So we have work to do across the system if we want a realistic chance of the Cinderella economy becoming a blueprint for tomorrow. We have to think about models for business, models for enterprise, models for economic activity that dilute these aspects of what capitalism has been, and the new models of ownership around community ownership, around shared public and private endeavours. What is the model built around? It's built around the simple idea that prosperity is a shared commodity. It's something that exists because of our social relationships.
La décroissance n'est pas un concept scientifique, c'est un mot obus qui sert à pulvériser l'idéologie dominante et à basculer sur un nouvel imaginaire. Et je dirais que le grand enjeu aujourd'hui, c'est de coupler ce mot obus qu'est la décroissance ou l'antiproductivisme ou l'anticapitalisme avec une série de mots chantiers. La relocalisation face au mondialisme, le ralentissement face au culte de la vitesse, la coopération contre l'esprit de concurrence, la planification démocratique contre le tout marché, la simplicité volontaire contre le mythe de l'abondance, le partage, la gratuité contre la marchandisation. Et finalement, il existe aujourd'hui des possibilités, je dirais, de faire non pas des pas en arrière, parce que la décroissance, c'est pas le retour au passé, mais un pas de côté, pour tout simplement rouvrir le champ des possibles. Ce n'est pas en culpabilisant les gens qu'on peut y arriver, c'est simplement en suscitant le désir, en donnant envie de changer de vie et, je dirais, de société.
But this time we need to move quickly, because we haven't yet found the solution to a bright future.
Il nous manque des illustrations de la vie meilleure, mais pas du tout. Ben, attends, excusez-moi, mais une société plus sobre ou plus écologiste est beaucoup plus intéressante, on vit beaucoup mieux, les relations sociales sont bien meilleures, détrompez-vous, on est plus tranquille, enfin, je ne sais moi, ça nous manque, voilà. Et ça, c'est quoi? Ce sont des écrivains, des cinéastes, je ne sais moi, ou des romanciers, ce ne sont pas des pauvres négociateurs à inventer le futur.
We need to go back to basics. We already needed to 40 years ago.
Bon, nous emballons pas. Récapitulons d'abord. Au départ, l'envie de bouger, de se déplacer, d'aller ailleurs, de changer d'air, le plus vite possible. Ça, pas de problème, c'est sûr.
Ça c'est sûr, mais ce qui est absolument sûr, c'est que ce foutoir mécanique, c'est pas la solution.
Si je suis loin de toi et que j'ai envie de te voir.
Pourquoi me voir?
Oh bah, pour te parler par exemple.
Bah, tu trouveras toujours quelqu'un à côté de toi pour parler.
Oui, d'accord. Et si j'ai envie de toi?
Ben, c'est pareil. Tu as toujours quelqu'un à côté de toi, comme moi j'ai quelqu'un à côté de moi, regarde.
December 2010, at the latest climate conference in Cancun in Mexico, did not mark the year 01. Neither a change in habits nor a reversal of a succession of acquired situations made it onto the agenda.
Countries do not send their scientists, their visionaries. They send diplomats and lawyers. And when you send diplomats and lawyers, the outcome is predictable. It will not be very bold.
Coming to an international agreement while maintaining the interests of each country is likely to take a long, long time. Promises that science and technology will pull us out of the climate crisis, perhaps in 50 or 80 years, are not enough. Mr. CO2 is an adversary possessing the power to plunge our entire planet into danger. We need to make certain choices about our society and to accept the radical theory of prosperity without growth.